Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video, a recent reads for 5 books completed. So the first book is The Ingenious Gentleman and Poet Frederico Garcia Lorca Ascends to Hell, written by Carlos Rojas, originally Spanish but now resident or went to live in America, I don't know if he's still alive, translated by Edith Grossman. Dennis Cooper, period. Italo Calvino, Into the War. Translated by Martin McLaughlin. Dutch author Hanna Bervoets, translated by Emma Raut. This is We Had to Remove This Post. And finally, The Public Burning, Robert Coover, which was a buddy read with Courtney and Zena, fellow booktubers. So I'm going to start with The Ingenious Gentleman and Poet Frederico Garcia Lorca Ascends to Hell. So I'd seen or read 2 of Lorca's 3 main plays, which he was most famous for, but he's also a poet. So I was familiar with his work. I was very interested in his story because he was killed young, assassinated by Franco's Phalange. He was gay. And this book is a very interesting treatment of Lorca and his life, particularly obviously the lead up to his death, as a mirror or a microscope onto Civil War Spain. So it's broken into sections. The first section is where he sort of discovers himself in hell, presumably dead, and it's a very thought-provoking setup of hell. I think it's described as a spiral, which I think it sort of channels Dante a little bit. And every inmate has their own personal theatre stage where memories of their life are played out or replayed. And although you can sense that there are an audience of people watching it, you can't see them, you can't contact them in any way. It's very much isolated, very much a sort of solipsistic existence. And obviously the fact that it's a theatre, Lorca was a playwright, so there's those sorts of resonances. But the whole approach to memory, I think, is channeling Proust, which is Rojas mentions quite a lot in these early sections. And the other thing it sort of references is Cervantes, of course. The Ingenious Gentleman and Poet is an echo of the description of Don Quixote. So you have this very sort of strange, but I think I was enthralled by the sort of setup of hell and the isolation and the sort of replaying of memories that Rojas set up here. And one of the memories is of a bullfighter friend of Lorca, who he wrote a poem about. I don't know if it was about him before the guy was gored to death by a bull or after, in sort of tribute. I haven't read the poem, although I'm quite keen to read it. Because bullfighting is the sort of traditional Spanish way of life and the ritual and sort of theatricality of it. It's absolutely embedded into the Spain of its age. And Lorca, in a way, was honouring it. So in that way, Lorca was not this sort of great sort of radical, rebel, but he was very much sort of wrapped into the fabric of Spanish life, which, gives sort of greater poignancy to the fact that he was assassinated by the arch conservatives that were the Phalangists. But he does also talk about, just before he died, he wrote this sort of outrageous play, polyphonic, which he, a bit Kafka-like, gave instructions that it must be destroyed on his death if it's never been performed. Now it's called The Public, and it intrigued me enough because I hadn't heard of it. Intrigued me enough. I've actually ordered a copy of it, and I'm going to read it as a play. It's not performed very often, I think, because it's so sort of extreme. So on the one hand, we've had this sort of honouring of the bullfighter, very sort of in the fabric of Spanish culture and life. And on the other hand, it's virulently anti-clerical, a bit like Jean Genet's work by the sound of it. Very radical, very extreme work, which, I wasn't aware that Lorca was on that. And that feeds into the character of Lorca in this book, because there are 2 Lorcas. There's actually 4, but I'll come to that in a minute. Whereby in the middle section, he meets two older versions of himself, almost sort of a parallel history if he'd survived, if he hadn't been assassinated. And one of those guys managed to survive not being kidnapped and assassinated by the house that Lorca was hiding out at, which was for a friend of his who happened to be a Phalangist sympathiser, which he thought would give him protection from the Phalange. The imaginary older Lorca managed to survive because he wasn't snatched from that house. But the Lorca here, watching a sort of speculative memory or a speculative alternative future, where he lives to sort of 60s or 70s or whatever, appreciates that by this cowardly act, as he sees it, of hiding in the house, he survives, but he knows he wouldn't write another word, because that side of his character, the cowardly side as he sees it, would sort of squash the sort of vibrant creative drive in him. And also there are two sides of his homosexuality given similar treatment. So by the middle stage, this has got a real lot going for me. I'm really into it. I'm learning some details about Lorca's sort of towards the end of his life. I'm learning about some of the art he produced that I wasn't aware of. I think it's a really creative approach to examining character through death and memory. And then the last part, we get he's been kidnapped. He's been arrested. Really is kidnapped, and he's expecting a trial. Well, he's expecting to be released because of the standing of the family that he was staying with. But if he's not going to be released, he's expecting a trial. But all he gets is an interview with the sort of head of the local militia, who is dying of cancer, having been dobbed in by a sort of an industrial mechanic, who sort of says, we fear what you can do with a pen more than you being a communist or whatever. And it's a really interesting back and forth where this dying captain of the militia has the power of life and death. So this military officer is sort of got some renown as a bit of a sort of a butcher of his prisoners, and he says to Lorca that, I got this fame and renown, but I'd rather not have to have done it that way, through so much blood on my hands. But I realised that it was just proof that God was insane, that if this is his justice and reward system, that so many men have to die, and that this man of God and conservatism, this militia man, had basically accused God of being insane. And when he was rounded on by others, said, what are you talking about? He goes, well, my only defence is that I'm insane to have said that God's insane. And he says, therefore, he needs to know one way or the other whether he's right that God is insane, or whether he was delusional and that he was insane. Therefore, he's going to do an insane act and release Lorca, and Lorca will be his spokesman. And again, Lorca is on the prongs of this dilemma of, if he sort of buys his freedom by saying, I'll do this on your behalf, that he'll never write again because it's a cowardly act whereby he's sort of trading his life in return for something he doesn't believe in. Or he'll stay true to his principles and be executed or assassinated. So all through the book there's this really, really interesting stuff, and told in a really interesting way. It just loses itself at the end, whereby the guy who snitched on Lorca is interviewed, and this is one of the scenes that Lorca sees in his theatre, is interviewed in his old age, looking back, by a writer for a book. And Lorca's sort of watching this, and this writer figure comes in after the description of Lorca's final moments and execution. And there's a scene at the end where, and it's not really a spoiler, there's a scene at the end where this writer is sitting with a woman partner and another guy, and saying that he can't, he's written this book, which is this book, but he can't publish it. It's too conflicting for him. And he hands the manuscript to this other guy who's a writer, who is Carlos Rojas, And of course, Carlos Rojas is publishing this book, which is fictionally someone else's book, which it isn't, but fictionally it's someone else's book about a fiction version of Lorca. So, you see how that plays out. But I felt it was a postmodernist thing that didn't actually work at all. It was unnecessary and just knocked half a star off, which is really a shame because, I haven't read books like this before or come across books like this before, and particularly about real life people. And I thought it was a really fascinating way to try and get under the skin of a real life historical person, which is so difficult to do. So 4.5 stars. And on to Period by Dennis Cooper. This is my first Dennis Cooper book. I had heard of The Marble Swarm, but it's very expensive in the UK, although having read this, I've just tracked down a copy that's coming from America, I think, which is reasonably priced. So this is the fifth in a series of loosely or thematically linked novels by Cooper. And it reminded me a bit of Burroughs. It reminded me a bit of the bizarro genre of people like Colton Mellick III. It's very out there. It's very extreme. It's lots of violence, male rape on men, abuse, torture. But a bit like Burroughs, it's not the acts described graphically for their own sake. It's more sort of as a metaphor for relationships between the parties in carrying out these acts. And it read to me very much that this is Cooper seeing how far he can push his writing. I don't mean for the sake of being extreme, but just how can you write extremes of desire, love, violence, all this sort of thing. And this is almost like an experiment. I don't mean it's unfinished, but it's like Cooper experimenting with how far can he take the form to find the purity of expression that he's after. So very loosely, plot-wise, all the characters are male. I don't think there are any women in it at all. And there's a writer called Walker whose boyfriend shot himself while they were having sex. And he's struggling to come to terms with that. Not only does he write about it, but he's always looking for a man who looks like his ex-boyfriend, and finds one who himself is in a sort of on-off relationship with another guy, a sort of slightly drifterish really. And they come across one of the most interesting characters in here, a mute and deaf character who's writing everything down. So he almost sort of writes down his timeline of his feelings. And these the two guys are both sort of dabble with Satanism, and they think if they offer up this guy that they can buy themselves immortality in return from Satan. There's also a band who I think are a duo. They're a satanic band. They're called The Omen, and they are serial killers, Satanists, and they become wrapped up with these other characters. So you're moving in and out the whole time through the relationships of these characters, and sometimes you think one's killed the other, but it's only in one. Almost like sort of American Psycho, is Bateman really killing all of those women? Because the characters have mirror doubles of themselves. So the one called Leon, there's also a character called Noel. The one called Nate, there's also a character called Etan. There's literally the blind, the mute and deaf boy is corresponding with some sort of persona presence that's on the other side of a mirror. So it's very much sort of mirror symmetry inverted in this book, and the characters are morphing in and out of the different types of relations with it. And the band, The Omen, was originally a creation in Walker's book, but then these two read the book, liked it, and formed a band which they called The Omen. So you can see the whole time this switching around. It also reminded me a bit of the Sam Shepard play Suicide in B flat, where a police chalk outline is on the floor in this house where someone's been murdered, and different characters come in and out and go and lie down, and imagining that they can transform themselves into somebody different by lying down in that. And there's an element of that here. So I was intrigued. I mean, all the extreme stuff didn't do a lot for me, but I was intrigued because I think he's driving towards something, his own personal vision of creativity and art. And I'm intrigued to see other attempts of him expressing that. So I'm definitely going to get at least another one in this 5 thematically linked series. So I gave it 4 stars. And onto Italo Calvino, Into the War. So this is one of his so-called autobiographical series, but it is it's heavily autobiographical, but it is fiction. It's 3 short stories about when war breaks out. He's 16 years old on the Italian-French border, and these are 3 stories about his experiences, or based on his experiences. So the first one is that the front lines just inside the border are being evacuated by the Italians because of bombing raids by French planes and stuff. And where he lives, the town or village that he lives, he sees these refugees and he has a great sympathy for them. He very much sort of connects to them. And, like any good sort of fascist country, that the youth, the adolescents, have to wear sort of uniforms. We had the Hitler Youth, and this is Mussolini's equivalents. And then the younger age group were like sort of Boy Scouts or Venture Scouts, also had to wear uniforms. So he's wearing this uniform because it's mandatory when he's sort of called up to help with the refugees, do duties around there, which he really wants to because he feels and identifies with them. But there's something about the uniform that stops him and makes him sort of shirk and shy away from the duties, the orders that he's given. And every time he's sort of summoned by an officer on the ground to go over there and help. By the time he gets there, his help isn't needed anymore. He's a 16-year-old boy. What can you do to some extent? Anyway, so when he's sort of involved in a group of people who are helping an old man to have the suit that's been provided, it spills over his fascist uniform. And he goes home and changes and comes back, and now he feels liberated, that he can genuinely help. He can actually roll up his sleeves, because he wants to, because he's a free human being. He wants to help these people rather than being ordered to under the auspices of the uniform. But interestingly, there's an inspection by the actual sort of Mussolini fascists, and they say we don't want anyone here who's not in uniform because it looks bad. It looks like a sort of ad hoc voluntary effort. So they send him home and he can't help people. And then right at the end, Mussolini drives through this town, this village in his limousine, or chauffeur-driven limousine. And it's almost like no one notices. And that's a theme that sort of is picked up in the other stories. So I thought it was a tremendous story. And then we get the next one where, again, in this sort of fascist youth brigade, they're sent to the only town that the Italians conquered from the French. And it's a ghost town. Obviously, the French have evacuated. And they've gone there because a Spanish phalangist, from the world of Lorca, hardened soldiers are marching up through there for some sort of parade, or I don't know exactly what it was. But this Mussolini youth are there to sort of line the parade and sort of, do military parade type things of standing at salute with their rifles, presenting arms, all that sort of stuff. But the phalangist group are delayed. The trains aren't running on time. So they have like a day and a half in this ghost town in France, which has now become Italian. And all the lot of them do is just loot these houses. It's a completely sort of unmilitary, non-disciplined looting. They're stuffing their uniforms and stuff, and their superiors are going, well, that's fine, when the phalange boys come, just hide it, but you're free to take it home. And again, the Calvino character here, he won't do it. It just goes against everything he believes in. He's interested with the rest of them in going to these houses and trying to grasp the evacuation in a similar way to what the first story was of the refugees. But he refuses to steal things, and his superior officer sort of says, basically insults anyone who goes home back to their hometown without having stolen this stuff. So he's conflicted, and he comes across this key in a door, and it used to be the English club in this town in France, but it's now become the fascist club, and it's someone sort of again in a sort of piecemeal fashion, sort of chiselled onto this key's wooden block handle. The insignia of the Italian fascist, saying, this is ours now. And he tapes the key, and then he decides he comes across a lot of these keys, and he tapes them all. But then he's worried that he's going to get found out, because unlike the other lot who have just stolen stuff that never belonged to them, this is important. This opens the door to Italian fascism. This allows the bureaucracy and administration of Italian fascism. So he throws them all into a pond. So in a way, it's an act of rebellion, because although he's not stolen them anymore, he has sort of hidden them, and that's going to throw a spanner in the works. And again, like when Mussolini passed through, no one noticed. When this Phalange group finally do turn up, they march past this Italian brigade of boys with barely noticing them. It's an empty show. It's an empty parade. So that's the second story. And the third story is he and his best mate from his town, who is a significant figure in the second story as well. And I think there's a bit of a crush there. Interesting, Calvino never sort of acknowledges it, but the way it's written, it's just there's a bit of a man crush going on there, or an adolescent boy crush. So they've been seconded to as anti-aircraft battery, which mainly means going around towns making sure people aren't breaking the blackout. And they've been assigned one night's duty in this school, and it's locked to them. They have to go and find the janitor with the key and stuff. And once night falls, the only people on the streets, because it's not under curfew, it's under blackout, it's not under curfew, the only people on the street are the middle classes, drinking, visiting whorehouses, that the actual labourers and farmhands, because they have to get up for early shifts, they're all asleep in their houses, and this town is given over to the middle classes. So there's a statement about class in here as well. But it's the thing I really got out of that third story is that it's about being on the cusp of adolescence and adulthood. That he and his mate bump into another guy who is absolutely experienced sexually. Tells them this, that, and the other, and Calvino's character realizes that his best mate, who talks a good game, actually can't, knows nothing really, very little more than Calvino. Once it's sort of revealed from this third character, and the boy crush sort of wears off at that point, and they revert to boys. They revert to almost pre-sexual boys. They play all these tricks using the darkness, where they sort of make people bump into them and stuff, and it's very puerile and adolescent. And in the end, the siren goes off, and they have to go back to their quarters. But at the point at which that happens, they'd actually had gone to a whorehouse on the recommendation of this third guy, and the prostitute there says, "Well, I'm not having you both in at the same time. I don't trust you. I'll take you one at a time. The other one will have to wait outside." So Calvino's character says to his mate, "Well, you go first. I'll wait." And it's while his mate is on the job inside that the siren goes off, and they have to hightail it back to the school. And his mate sort of says, "Oh, how unsatisfactory it was, because it was interrupted. It was literally coitus interruptus." And Calvino sort of doesn't care. He's reverted to a pre-sexual being. He was going to sleep with the prostitute, didn't happen, but he doesn't feel, unlike most boys, he doesn't feel sort of cheated or a sort of massive yearning. It's like sort of shrugging the shoulders. He's pre-adolescent at that stage. And then right at the end, there's a thing involving his sort of dreaming about his father and stuff, which I didn't really get into. But Calvino's such a good writer that even though this is fairly, this is not like the experimental work of things, or even the fable work of our ancestors, but it's just terrific. It's so accessible. It's so evocative. 5 stars. And on to Hanna Bervoets. We had to remove this post, which covers an interesting subject, which is those who work for third-party organisations who are contracted to do the monitoring for things like Facebook and YouTube, and seeing all this violence and filth and just unpleasantness, how desensitizing it is. Now I think that's a really interesting thing to study, But there's so many problems with this book. The first thing is the main protagonist is already desensitized before she gets the job. I don't think that's intended, but that's how she comes across. So she's a lesbian and she's in a relationship with someone she meets in the job. And this person sort of has a bit of a nervous breakdown. And she's in the bathroom. I think she's sick. She's being sick. And she's sort of bawling in tears. And the protagonist is there, arm around the shoulder. But she won't do any more than that. I mean, she'll clear up the mess afterwards, but she can't. She can't emotionally support her partner. She's already desensitized before she gets this job, and therefore, if it's a book showing the journey of someone being desensitized, there is no journey. And if you read Dave Eggers' The Circle, it's a different sort of desensitization. It's a desensitization through the corporate culture of tech giants, but it's brilliantly done compared to this. So that's the first thing, is actually it's not really about desensitization of online content at all, of having to view too much of it. The second thing is, I assume this is aimed at a sort of fairly mainstream market, and I therefore understand that they're not going to go into graphic detail about the really unpleasant things, the examples of really unpleasant things that they're viewing. But actually, most of what is offered as examples, I didn't find troubling. Maybe that says something about me, I don't know, which diminishes its power. But I accept it's a tricky thing to pitch right, because if you go so sort of graphic and appalling and repelling in the detail, then that's going to make this book less like have chances of being mass market. So that's another problem. A third problem is that it uses the Holocaust as a plot device, because she and her girlfriend, as I say, they both work there. One day they're having a cigarette break, and an argument starts up about flat Earth, flat Earth's, denying that the Earth is round, and her partner sort of says, well, I'm convinced by the evidence. I don't feel it's been proved that the Earth is round. I'm not saying that I'm a flat earther, but I'm agnostic, which comes as a shock to the protagonist, because she didn't realise that her partner felt that way. And then the same thing happens, only this time it's about Holocaust denial. And the partner says, well, there are good arguments. Both sides put up good arguments. It's the Trump thing when, after the Charlottesville riot, and he sort of says, well, it's both sides were responsible. It's that sort of equivalence, and it happens here. And again, the protagonist is understandably shocked, that her girlfriend has these views, and it causes a huge row, and they split up. And the reason I say it's a plot device is because either the protagonist doesn't really know her girlfriend at all. She's surprised by the flat Earth stuff, and here she's surprised that she seemingly can hold an equivalence of Holocaust denial and Holocaust, fact, which is problematic. That I did say that she's already desensitized, so maybe she wouldn't know that that's what her girlfriend really thinks, or what. It doesn't seem to be quite that, because what the author seems to be tilting at is that the girlfriend wants to get out of the relationship anyway, and deliberately provokes the split by leaping to this argument, because she knows it will drive the protagonist insane. Which is why I think, well, you're reducing the Holocaust to a plot device. And both the flat Earth stuff and the Holocaust denial stuff, both sides are represented, but in such a truncated, foreshortened way that neither issue is actually dealt with in the serious, high-minded way that it needs to be. And I think that's problematical. And then finally, the writing is appalling. There's not one good simile or metaphor in here. And I'm going to give 3 examples. And I hope you're not drinking hot tea. That's all I can say. Oh, hi, Sigrid says when she sees us. She sounds like she wasn't expecting us. Like we're 2 acquaintances from her salsa dancing class, who she only invited out of politeness, and shit, now suddenly we're the first guest to arrive at the party. Well, that's a tortuous simile, but it gets worse. I know I should keep my mouth shut. I'm even apologising in my head because once again I'm talking over her, but I can't help myself. I feel like a goose being force fed bullshit through a metal tube. Well, if that's a reference to foie gras, she's mixed and mutilated her metaphors. She doesn't need the word bullshit there. I feel like a goose being force fed bullshit through a metal tube. So it's not a metaphor at all, although it's intended to be one. And then maybe the piece de resistance, I think, possibly. What exactly are you sorry about? Sigrid asked, and I thought that was kind of a weird question, though I didn't change course accordingly, like when you notice that shrimp tastes funny, but you're already swallowing it. I'm sorry, the writing is appalling. Funnily enough, the best books about this book were the corporate culture of this agency that does the moderation. That their times, their breaks to the toilet, and they're only allowed a 7 minute break and all this sort of thing. That was more powerful than the content that they had to view, which was toned down, and the shoddy, you know, plodding plot devices of very serious issues. 2.5 stars. And finally, The Public Burning, which, as I say, was a buddy read with Courtney Ferreter and Zena over at Burning About the Books, reading about the books. So this is my 4th Coover, and I've realised that this book has a lot in common with his book called Lucky Pierre, which is a satire based around the porn industry. This is based around the Cold War and the executions of the Rosenbergs as communist spies. And both employ very similar excess. Coover is a writer of excess in both of those books, which is odd because one of his books I really liked, called The Universal Baseball Association, it's not excess at all. I mean, it's a flight of fantasy. It's a guy who literally invents a fantasy baseball game and populates all the players as in his mind. He gives them characteristics and they have dilemmas off the field and all this sort of stuff. It's brilliant, but it's reined in. Whereas here in Lucky Pierre, it's over the top and it's satire with a mallet or a sledgehammer. It ain't great. It ain't great. So it's sort of framed as a battle between between a superhero and a supervillain. The superhero is Uncle Sam, who is a sort of larger than life character, sort of mixture of, let's say, superhero and yeehaw cowboy, who can enter and possess the body of anyone, but usually the American president, because that's obviously the most powerful and useful person for Uncle Sam to defend, capitalism, religion, the American way. And the supervillain is called the Phantom, which is communism, atheism, state socialism, antithesis of capitalism. And one of the things the book does well is actually, how the world at that time in the early 60s, all the stuff that was going on in countries like Indonesia and Germany and Kenya and all this sort of stuff. And that was really good. That was really knitted together well, I thought. And Uncle Sam initially is a very entertaining character because he is so over the top. The other character in here, or main character other than the Rosenbergs themselves, is Richard Nixon, the vice president to Eisenhower, who actually in real life didn't have a huge lot of involvement with the whole Rosenbergs thing. He'd had an earlier one with I think Alger Hiss, but for some reason this is all about him and his slow, steady campaign to elevate himself to the ultimate office of president, which of course we know he did achieve. But I don't believe it was on the back of anything to do with the Rosenbergs. But anyway, the problem is there's so much detail. Now, I'm lucky. I studied American history both at school and at university alongside British history. I didn't do European history because I figured that with one president, you only have to sort of study one character or one person's actions as against the gamut of European kings and queens. So I've always sort of veered towards American history. So I knew a lot of the names in here, and there was still a lot I didn't know. But I wonder anyone who isn't American, they're just going to get lost in these names. And at times they just become lists of names. They're not even doing anything. They're signposts. They're signposts to a certain American way of life at the time. And so to give you an example of that, the penultimate chapter is the assassination, because the satire part is it's going to happen in Times Square. It's this huge cultural and social and entertainment event, and the electric chairs are set up on a stage in Times Square. And of course, being America, they put on a huge pre-show, and anyone is at the show. And a really clever observation is that after the executions, there's going to be a heavyweight boxing match, which I just thought was a brilliant idea, a brilliant image of the grossness of this sort of public spectacle is like a boxing match or a gladiatorial thing. And as part of the pre-show entertainment, Coover writes a very, very good sketch for the Marx Brothers, as if they had come up with a sketch about the Rosenbergs. And it's funny, it gets all the different characters of the Marx Brothers right, it's absolutely on point. Then a few pages later, we get a list of the 96 senators of the time, of 1963, whenever it was. 53. Why? It's just a list. Most of those names don't mean anything. I mean, obviously, Joe McCarthy's there and Edward Kennedy's there. I couldn't see what it was doing. There's interminable lists of the celebrities. And again, Coover starts doing things really microscopically and really well. So there's a great gag where it's either Winston Churchill or an actor who's playing Winston Churchill is on stage, and Coover remarks, or the authorial voice remarks, most people in the audience in Times Square would not know who this guy was. They think it was W.C. Fields, because there's a sort of certain resemblance. That's a great gag. I loved it. Brilliant. That's all you need to say. But no, then we have this prolonged skit about the American Revolutionary War and how Churchill, anachronistically, is the British leader who loses the war and loses America as America gains its independence. Don't need it. You've done the gag. You've done the clever gag. He does it again. He has Betty Crocker, she of the American culinary goddess. That couple of the other entertainment, the big names from the American TV in the 50s. I can't remember exactly who it was. I don't think it was the Three Stooges, but it's like the Three Stooges. They're having a custard pie fight. And a custard pie lands on one of the electric chairs. And Betty Crocker, who's the sort of hostess of the whole thing, she dips her finger in, licks it, and sort of says, too bitter. Again, great gag. But then, unfortunately, Coover seconds her to give us a litany of names of celebrities and politicians who are in the audience. It just goes on and on and on forever. And then she's knocked over and her false teeth fall out. That's gross comedy. Well, we've had a really subtle, funny, satirical thing of when she's dipped her finger in a custard pie that's landed on an electric chair, which is a metaphor for the whole event itself. That's the great gag. And then he blows it. And this is sort of what he does in Lucky Pierre as well, I feel. And then we get this sort of tawdry, there's a lot of the Nixon sort of reminiscences of, he's got a Quaker mother and a Catholic drunk, mean father. There's a lot of delving back into that, into his first girlfriend before he met and married Pat, how he's not very successful with women, he's repressed, and of course there's this sort of fantasy thing where he falls in love with Ethel Rosenberg. And you think, oh God, how dreary a male fantasy. I'm going to save the woman, save her life, and we're going to go off to the sunset together. But actually, she's playing him. You think, oh, good on you, girl. She turns the power around, even though she's in jail. But actually, you think about that, and this isn't Coover's fault, maybe, because this is written in the 70s. That actually, that trope of, oh, you can't trust women are only out to screw men, is the sentiment most on offer in gangster rap, so that was unsatisfactory. And then after that scene, Nixon, having visited her in the prison, Nixon ends up through a tunnel, almost like a water slide. He emerges on stage with his trousers around his ankles because he'd been sort of having, sort of the lead up to sex with Ethel Rosenberg. And all these people are shocked. Here's the vice president with his trousers around his ankle. So he has to do something to save his reputation. And what he does is he challenges everyone in the audience to drop their own pants, because it's a symbol of America's lack of inhibition, their sort of no anxiety, their, you know, you do this, you can show the world anything, all this sort of stuff. And they do. Everybody drops their pants. And there's one line in that where, after the sort of the great feeling of liberation and lack of inhibition, everyone then starts looking at their neighbour, looking at their junk. You know, is theirs bigger than mine, or whatever? And that is the insecurity, that is the anxiety of capitalism, not the gross orgy that then precedes it. That's crass. Again, sledgehammer stuff, because he'd done the work with one line of everyone looking over at their neighbour thinking, I want what he's got. That is capitalism. Yeah, capitalism is also the gross consumption of an orgy of possession and all that. Yeah, it is. But he'd done the hard work and then he blew it. So I found this book so frustrating. It's how many pages long? 500 and something? Yeah, it's 520 pages long. There's a really good book in here with some fantastic observations, some great gags. But it would only be 200 pages long. And it's that excess, it's that overwriting, it's that lack of subtlety, when there is subtlety in here, that ultimately for me reduced this to, I think, 3 stars. Very disappointing. I actually think Coover's not a writer for me, if he's always going to, you know, gravitate towards the excess. Although I still stand by, you know, the Universal Baseball Society or Association, whatever it's called, I love it. 5 stars. That's not going to change my mind. But that seems to be the outlier rather than these types of books. So I'm not sure I'm going to read any more Coover, which, you know, I can be persuaded maybe. But the other book of his I read is called Noir, which is supposed to be a satire or a pastiche of noir writing, but seemed to be very straight. Actually, a sort of homage. It wasn't sort of satirising it at all. So I got nothing out of that. I mean, it's not over the top, you know, like this is, but I just couldn't get to grips with what it was trying to do. So just to wrap up, so the ingenious gentleman and poet Frederico Garcia Lorca Ascends to Hell by Carlos Rojas, 4.5 stars. Period by Dennis Cooper, 4 stars. I'm intrigued. I'm looking forward to reading more. Italo Calvino, Into the War, 5 stars. We Had to Remove This Post by Hanna Bervoets, 2.5 stars. And The Public Burning by Robert Coover, 5 stars. That's 5 stars, God, 3 stars. What I'm currently reading, as I said in my previous video, I'm actually in a writing sort of protracted session trying to finish my book. We had a 5-day long bank holiday, including the weekend last week for the Queen's Jubilee. I got a lot of, you know, useful work done there. So my aim is to finish my novel, the final draft of it, by the end of July. So again, that will impact my reading, because if I'm spending time writing, I'm not using that time to read. But one commitment I do have throughout June is a group read of James Baldwin, Another Country, with Roz at Scallydandling Around the Books, Zena at Beating Around the Books, Courtney Ferreter. Is there someone else? Not sure. Anyway, so that's our first check-in is this weekend. So I will be committing to that throughout June. I'm not sure what other books I will fit in around that. So there you have it. Till next time. Thanks very much.